This week I'm talking about how to deal with being manipulated by others. So, let's talk. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast full of simple ideas for better mental health. I'm your host, Jeremy Godwin, and I'm an Australian writer and speaker who spent most of the 2010s dealing with severe depression and anxiety, and that led me to change careers to study mental health. In this show, I use my knowledge of psychology, sociology, and counselling, combined with my personal experiences of dealing with mental illness, to bring you a show full of ways to improve your mental well-being one step at a time. Each week I look at one specific topic and go through simple things you can do to improve your mental health. In this episode, you'll find out what manipulation and gaslighting are, why they can be damaging for your mental health, and how to respond if you feel like you're being manipulated. So, get comfortable and let's talk about mental health. Hello and welcome to episode 56, and thanks for joining me. This week is all about manipulation, so let's jump into it. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been on the receiving end of manipulation in the past, and often it can happen in both our personal and professional relationships without us even realizing it. If you've been on the receiving end of being manipulated, it can cause all sorts of issues, like having trouble trusting people and even doubting yourself and your abilities. Now, because it's something that can potentially happen in our closest relationships, such as with our partner, our family, or our friends, it's worthwhile having a chat about how to spot the signs and what to do if you suspect that you're being manipulated. And so that's what I'm exploring this week. Just a heads up that next week I'll be looking at emotions, and I'll cover on what's coming up in that episode at the end of this one. So make sure you listen all the way to the end. So what is manipulation? Manipulation can be described as when someone does or says something in order to try and change the behavior or perception of another person or group of people. We see this happen a lot on a social scale, such as when governments use propaganda to try and enforce a particular set of beliefs or way of behaving, or when individuals try to convince the public of a particular event or situation without any actual evidence. Something that we're seeing happening more and more lately thanks to social media, and of course the more extreme elements of political and social life that seem to have much more of a platform now than in the past. On a more personal level, manipulation can happen in our individual relationships, and it's not always negative. If you think about a time when someone has had a positive influence on you, that is actually a form of manipulation, but it's being used for harmless and helpful means. When it becomes an issue is when someone tries to coerce you to do something that you don't want to do, or that is not in your best interest. That's where manipulation becomes a force for negativity, and it can have a damaging effect on your mental health. Think of it this way: influencing involves having positive intentions towards the other person, while manipulating involves negative intentions. The thing is that we can all do it to some extent, and sometimes we may not even realize we're doing it. When we tell someone what they want to hear or what we want them to hear rather than the actual truth, it's a form of manipulation because we're trying to control that person's opinion of us or the way that they perceive us in that moment. And we also do it in our closest relationships with our partners, family, and friends, where we might say or do something to try and have them respond in a particular way. Sometimes that's simply because our needs aren't being met in that moment, while at other times it can be more about trying to make them behave in a specific way in order to satisfy our wants. The most common example is probably how we react when we get into an argument with someone that we care about. The different ways that we react, like yelling or sulking or whatever, will quite likely have an effect on how the other person reacts. And so often we can find ourselves trying to manipulate the other person, whether or not we're even aware that we're doing it. I just did it this morning. I was so annoyed at my partner for talking over me repeatedly while we were in the car together that I snapped, and it took me a minute or two to calm myself down. In case I haven't mentioned it before, I fully acknowledge the fact that I am prone to being reactive when I'm angry or frustrated, and I'm continuing to work really hard on being able to hit the pause button so that I can calm down and, then respond in a much more thoughtful and rational way. The thing is that just because I talk about this stuff all the time, that certainly doesn't mean that I get it right all of the time, and I'm a very long way from being perfect. Anyway, The thing is that every time you give someone the silent treatment, or when you nag at them or yell at a loved one, it's a form of manipulation because you're modifying your behavior in order to try and make the other person change theirs. Now, whether or not that is deliberate or subconscious and whether or not it actually works is completely irrelevant. It's still an attempt to sway another person to do or say what you want them to, which can potentially be a negative thing if it happens repeatedly as a means of controlling the other person. Like I said, we all do it at some point or another, so the important thing to be aware of is that when it happens a lot, it can become chronic manipulation, which can have long-term damaging effects on your relationships as well as your self-esteem and the other person's self-esteem. So I guess the main point I'm making here is that if you find yourself doing these sorts of things, you need to really think about whether or not it's a healthy choice, because there's a massive difference between influencing and manipulating. Now, the bulk of the conversation today is going to be about feeling that you're being manipulated by other people, but it would be remiss of me not to have an honest conversation up front, because the reality is that not many of us are completely innocent when it comes to these types of behaviors. Like all things, it's about being aware of what you're doing. And if the intention is to help someone in a healthy way and they're happy to receive that help, then it's great, that's a positive influence. But if not, then it's negative, and that is where it can become manipulation. It's an important distinction to make and be clear on, because for the bulk of this episode I'll be talking about the negative side of being manipulated by other people, along with things that you can do to ensure that you're not deliberately or accidentally manipulating other people. Because as I often say on this show, how we treat others has a direct impact on how they treat us. Can I just say though that that does not mean that if you are being manipulated by someone that you have been manipulating them. Let me be very clear and say that is not at all what I'm covering off in this point. My main point here is that we just need to be conscious of how we're acting as well, rather than it just being a focus on the external, because we need to take responsibility for our own internal behaviors. So we'll be talking about both. It's two kind of different subjects, but we'll be talking about them side by side. Now, speaking of being manipulated by other people, at the start of the episode I mentioned a very specific form of manipulation which has become quite well known in recent years, gaslighting. It's even been the subject of a recent song by the US country pop band The Chicks. According to Healthline, gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that's seen in abusive relationships. It's the act of manipulating a person by forcing them to question their thoughts, memories, and the events occurring around them. A victim of gaslighting can be pushed so far that they question their own sanity. Gaslighting, whether intentional or not, is a form of manipulation. Gaslighting can happen in many types of relationships, including those with bosses, friends, and parents. But one of the most devastating forms of gaslighting is when it occurs in a relationship between a couple. And you can find the link for that quote in the transcript. So moving on to the next part of today's conversation, normally I jump now into a point around why this topic or why focusing on this topic is important for mental health. But because we're talking about being manipulated by other people as a fairly large amount of today's conversation, I'm actually going to look at first, why do people manipulate others? The reason why most people manipulate others is for control and power, or to achieve a specific outcome that meets their wants and their needs. Some people do it for attention, some people do it for power, some do it to achieve a specific agenda or to undermine another person. There are a huge number of different reasons why people manipulate others. Some people do it deliberately, while others may not even be aware that they're doing it. A common example of that is when one or both of your parents tries to change your behavior in a particular way. They might believe that they're acting out of love and the desire to protect you, but the result is manipulation in the form of making you feel guilty for not doing as they wish, or making you feel bad about a life decision that you've made. This kind of stuff is one of the things that I talked about back in the Boundaries episode 53, as well as the Family episode, which was episode 19. And as I said back then, it's always your choice whether or not to engage when this kind of stuff happens, and I'll revisit that in a little bit. The thing to be aware of here is that being a relative does not automatically give anyone special permission to treat you in a manipulative way. Another piece around why people manipulate is often rooted in a whole bunch of stuff like the way they were brought up, their emotional baggage, their level of mental well-being, their level of self-awareness, and some really fundamental emotional drivers like fear and security. Regardless of whether or not they're aware of what they're doing, the result is the same, and quite frankly, ignorance is never an excuse to treat another person poorly. It's why I'm so vocal about how important it is to be assertive, which I talked about in episode 45, and why you absolutely should not put up with shit from other people, which you can do by setting clear boundaries and sticking to them. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, there are also a number of personality disorders that can commonly involve manipulative behaviours, such as borderline personality disorder, or BPD, and narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. Like anything, there are lots of different ways that it can manifest, and it may not be the same for every single person with these specific disorders. One example of why this type of behaviour is often found in people diagnosed with those disorders is noted in an article by Good Therapy, which I'll link to in the transcript. And the note is, for many with BPD, manipulation may be a means of meeting their emotional needs or obtaining validation, and it often occurs when the person with BPD feels insecure or abandoned. As many people with BPD have witnessed or experienced abuse, manipulation may have developed as a coping mechanism to get needs met indirectly. Individuals with narcissistic personality, NPD, may have different reasons for engaging in manipulative behaviour. As those with NPD may have difficulty forming close relationships, they may resort to manipulation in order to keep their partner in the relationship. Characteristics of narcissistic manipulation may include shaming, blaming, playing the victim, control issues, and gaslighting. And again, the link for that is in the transcript. So now let's talk about why it's important to be aware of manipulative behaviours and also to address this stuff for the sake of your mental health and well-being. Manipulation can have a damaging effect on your mental health and well-being. According to the same article I mentioned before from Good Therapy, which the link is in the transcript, if unaddressed, manipulation can lead to poor mental health outcomes for those who are manipulated. Chronic manipulation in close relationships may also be a sign emotional abuse is taking place, which in some cases can have a similar effect to trauma, particularly when the victim of manipulation is made to feel guilty or ashamed. Victims of chronic manipulation may feel depressed, develop anxiety, develop unhealthy coping patterns, constantly try to please the manipulative person, lie about their feelings, put another person's needs before their own, or find it difficult to trust others. And again, the source is in the transcript for that. So let's be really clear about this. Chronic manipulation, including gaslighting, is a form of emotional abuse, which can leave very deep wounds that take a lot of time and a hell of a lot of work to heal. It completely undermines your self-confidence, self-esteem, and even your self-respect. And in cases of serious abuse, it can put you in a dangerous position or force you to make unhealthy choices. So some of the common signs of manipulation include lies and dishonest behaviour, threats, withholding information, using sex or affection as a tool to achieve specific outcomes or deliberately withholding it as a tool to get their own way, verbal abuse, isolating someone from their friends or family, feigning ignorance or innocence but then repeating the same behaviours, and making you feel guilty about not doing or saying what they want. I could spend hours here talking about all the different signs of manipulation, but instead I'll put a link in the transcript to an article from Psych Central, which is called How to Spot Manipulation, which is a fairly quick read and might be useful if you think that you're on the receiving end of manipulative or controlling behaviour, but would like a little bit more clarity first on some of the more common forms. So find that link in the transcript. And I've also put in an additional one from Psychology Today titled 14 Signs of Psychological and Emotional Manipulation. So head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes where you'll find the transcript for this episode and all past episodes. Now, revisiting that article on gaslighting that I mentioned earlier from Healthline, and again, the link for that is also in the transcript, let me quote, "Signs that you are a victim of gaslighting include feeling like everything you do is wrong, always thinking it's your fault when things go wrong, often questioning whether your response to your partner is appropriate, for example, wondering if you were too unreasonable or not loving enough, avoiding giving information to friends or family members to avoid confrontation about your partner, feeling isolated from friends and family, or feeling hopeless and taking little or no pleasure in activities you used to enjoy." So again, you'll find that link in the transcript. Now, when it comes to gaslighting, you might experience the person saying things to you that they later deny having said, or hiding things from you, or claiming that people are talking about you when they're not. In general, it's about making you doubt yourself in order to control you. And so that's why being aware of these behaviors and also doing something about it is so important for your mental health and well-being, because of the long-lasting damage that these types of behaviors can have on you. So with all of that in mind, let's get into the how-to part of this week's episode, how to tackle manipulation. So I'm going to cover two different things here. First, how to ensure that you are not deliberately or accidentally manipulating someone. And then second, what to do if you're being manipulated or that you might be being manipulated by someone. Let me start with talking about how to ensure that you don't manipulate anyone. And let me say this as simply as I possibly can. Don't manipulate other people. You're responsible for your words and actions. And so trying to control another person or make them do what you want when it isn't in their best interest is just plain wrong. But you kind of don't need me to tell you that. You don't get a free pass because you're in love or because it's a family member or a long-term friend. Manipulating other people is unkind and it can do real harm. And something I talk about all the time on this show is that our goal should be to do no harm and be kind to both ourselves or others, along with giving more than we take. I think the simplest way to do this is to stop and reflect in each situation and to consider your intentions. If your intentions are good, in other words, if you're trying to help, but you also understand and accept that it's up to the other person whether or not they accept your help, then great. But if your intention is to get your own way or to control the other person, then I think deep down you have to know that is not a fair and decent thing to do. And how you treat other people will have a direct effect on how they treat you. So choose to do no harm, be kind, and give more than you take. Focusing on building and maintaining your self-awareness is vital because it helps you to be more honest with yourself about what you might need to focus on in order to be the best version of yourself possible. And just an FYI here that self-awareness is a topic that I'll be covering in more detail early next year in its own episode. If being self-aware and modifying your behavior is a challenge for you, then it's important to do something about it. Find a counselor or therapist who you feel comfortable with, or work with a coach who is experienced. And it might take a few attempts to find someone who you feel comfortable with, so be patient. And then work with that person to dig into what's going on so that you can address the root cause or causes. Okay, so with that stuff out of the way, now let's talk about what to do if you're being manipulated or suspect that you're being manipulated by another person. So first, reflect and listen to your instincts. Regular listeners will know that I love reflection, and I explored it in detail back in episode 12, so do check that out if you haven't already. And reflection is a way of sitting and looking at things in a non-judgmental and more objective manner than you might if you just react to the emotions that you might be feeling. Emotions are usually a sign that there's something that needs our attention, but if we just react to them without taking the time to consider why they're happening, then we can potentially end up making things more difficult for ourselves. The thing about a structured reflection exercise is that it makes you sit down and look at your feelings, and then begin the process of digging into them layer by layer in order to better understand what sits deep down in your core so that you can address that. Like I often say on this show, it's about treating the root cause rather than just the symptom. If you're feeling like you're being manipulated, dig into that feeling and find out what's going on and what issues might be lurking under the surface. My next point is to confront the person in a calm and objective way. This isn't about having a screaming fit or creating a drama. You're not on The Real Housewives. Instead, it's about having a rational conversation. Explain what it is that you've noticed happening. For example, I feel that often I need to justify my decisions to you. Now, look, it's up to you whether or not you want to say how the behavior or action has made you feel. And certainly, counselors and therapists often tend to encourage you to speak your truth in this way because it's about encouraging you to take back your control and power. However, in the case of manipulative people, you may find that talking about your feelings, that those types of statements can be used against you at a later date. Not everyone, but sometimes it can happen. So my advice is this: by all means, share your feelings the first time that you address the issue, but be aware that if you have to address it more than once, then the time for explaining how you feel is probably over, because by that point, that person knows exactly what they're doing. It's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Now, one other piece of advice here in all of these interactions is to avoid absolute statements. And what that means is when you say things like, you always do this, or you never let me do this, because they're like a red rag to a bull in a fight or in an argument, and will quite likely result in the argument escalating, which is just completely counterproductive. Also, nobody is 100% one thing or the other, so they're not the best types of statements to use. Your focus should be on having a rational and calm discussion, or at least remaining that way yourself. You can't control what the other person does or doesn't do. If that means that the conversation gets heated and you then have to remove yourself, do so. Okay, so my next piece of advice is to then set boundaries and stick to them. And I talked about this extensively back in episode 53, so again, check that out for more. But in short, the goal here should be to state what you will and will not accept from the other person, and then stick to those boundaries. That includes setting boundaries for yourself as well, such as committing to just not engaging the next time the person tries to manipulate you, or deciding that you will call out the behavior when it's happening in order to stop it in its tracks. I tend to work on a 3 strikes and you're out approach to boundaries. However, for bigger issues, I'm very assertive in the sense of saying, this is not acceptable. And then if it happens again, there are consequences such as changing the nature of my relationship with that person. And maybe that's just because my tolerance for bullshit has gone out the window over the past few years. You need to decide what works best for you. And provided that your intentions are to do no harm, be kind, and give more than you take, I think you're on the right track. Now, you may also find the episode on assertiveness, episode 45, to be quite helpful here. Plus, there's a book by Dr. Harriet B. Breaker, which was published in 2003, called Who's Pulling Your Strings? How to Break the Cycle of Manipulation and Regain Control of Your Life, which you might find useful, especially because it contains practical advice that you can use to help you address these sorts of issues. And then moving on to my final point, which is that if the manipulative behavior continues, walk away. You know, I often make the point in this show that we shouldn't just stop talking to someone because ghosting is bad. And if there are issues, then we should try to work them out like rational and compassionate adults. But sometimes the other person just does not want to cooperate. And if that's the case, then you are wasting your time and also potentially putting yourself in a vulnerable and even dangerous position. So cut the cord. There are far too many stories of people having their lives shattered by someone who manipulated them into a substance abuse issue, or ruined their finances, or completely isolated them from family and friends. And I know it can be tough to hear, and I know this isn't the case for everybody, but if someone is manipulating you into doing things that are not healthy, and they refuse to change their behavior, then you need to walk away. That can be terrifying, and of course, every person's situation is unique. So my advice here is to always put your overall health and well-being first in all things. And if that means that you need to find support to get yourself out of a situation where you're being manipulated, then there are plenty of services that can help you. But take that next step. Because when it comes to manipulation and mental health, what it all boils down to is this. You are in charge of what you do and don't do in life. And when other people try to control you in order to achieve their own needs or wants, it can have seriously negative effects on your well-being. Chronic manipulation, including gaslighting and other forms of manipulative behavior, can do a lot of harm over time if they're not addressed. And the reality is that when this type of behavior occurs repeatedly, especially when you tell the person to stop but they continue regardless, it's a form of emotional abuse. Regardless of the other person's relationship to you, nobody has the right to try and control your life. And so if you are being manipulated, then you owe it to yourself to take back your power. Each week I like to finish up by sharing a quote about the week's topic and encourage you to take a few moments to really reflect on it and consider what it means to you. So this week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is: "If you allow people to make more withdrawals than deposits in your life, you will be out of balance and in the negative. Know when to close the account." Let me repeat that. If you allow people to make more withdrawals than deposits in your life, you will be out of balance and in the negative. Know when to close the account. Alright, that's nearly it for this week. Next week, I'll be talking about emotions. We live with our emotions every day, but how often do we actually sit down and think about what's driving them and what they might be trying to tell us? So in next week's episode, I'll be talking about what emotions are and what they're not, why understanding your emotions is important for good mental health, and how to better manage your emotions. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released in the morning of Monday the 14th of December in the Asia Pacific region, including Australia, the evening of Sunday the 13th of December in the UK, Ireland, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and the afternoon of Sunday the 13th of December in the US, Canada, Central America, and South America. Head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au for past episodes, including audio links and full transcripts. And while you're there, join the Let's Talk About Mental Health mailing list to have exclusive updates land in your inbox. Those of you on my email list find out about new stuff at least a week before anybody else. So if you like this show, sign up at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook at LTA Mental Health, where I post extra content throughout the week. That's at LTA Mental Health on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.